thank you. There I am, Laurie. Thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to present this morning. Okay, a quick overview of what I'm going to cover in the next hour and a half or so. I think is the time slot I've got. First half of the session, I'm going to cover a little bit about the actuarial valuation, which James mentions that we'll be carrying out with effect from next March, and a little bit of the background as to how we do the work, and then move on to some of the outlook for 2016 and the sort of things that we're currently looking at with the fund. The work has already started on that in the background, working with James and Debbie and the other fund officers. And then I'm going to move on to some more general LGPS issues, cover some of the stuff that James has been talking about in terms of the structural reform, not so much the structure angle, but sort of taking a step back and looking at what's going on from a high level and where funds might have to go over the next few months and years if they're to be compliant, if you like, with what the government's looking for, and then just a few other general areas that are of interest to you as fund employers. So, looking forward, first of all, if looking forward is the right expression to the 2016 actuarial evaluation, really there's going to be a number of challenges, a number of issues that we're going to have to work through as part of the valuation. And the ones from the fund's perspective I've really put here. The government's austerity changes show no let-up. The maturity of the fund's changing. The employer numbers are increasing. There's greater national scrutiny on what funds are doing in terms of evaluation position. Much more, the LGPS board are looking nationally at what all LGPS funds are up to in terms of the funding positions and their approaches to the actuarial valuation. We've got the asset pooling initiatives, which James has talked about, and in general across the LGPS, there's more of a move to look a little bit more closely about the risks that are being run, both on the investment side and by the employers in terms of their funding positions going forward. So really, what we want for the 2016 actuarial valuation is a clear strategy and some strong governance to manage the process. The employer perspective, similar, some similar key themes, but not all of those on the previous slide are relevant to the employers. Obviously, the funding position of the fund is causing upward cost pressures in terms of the contribution rates going forward. The contribution rates are increasing as a percentage of payroll at a time when in general payrolls are falling as well. So we've got this dual effect of pension fund deficits and budget cuts for employer, so causing a little bit of a pressure cooker there. And really we do recognise in carrying out the valuation next year that affordability is really a key issue for the employers going forward, as it always is, but it's coming even more to the fore now. Okay, a little bit then about what we do, why we do it, and how we go about the actuarial evaluation process itself. Really, when we're carrying out the actuarial evaluation process, what we're trying to get to is a situation where a member leaves service or retires and benefits come into payments, we want to be in a situation where you've got enough assets to be able to pay benefits to that member without the employer having to dip into the coffers at that stage going forward. Now, that's what we try and do. We don't always get there, but that's the aim when we are funding the pension fund, and when we're funding any pension fund, not just the LGPS. So, if you try and work that principle forward, what it really leads you to is you want to keep a body of assets in there which is enough to cover the value of the liabilities which have built up to the date that you're doing the calculations. and then a separate calculation of how much you need to pay in the future to cover the benefits which are going to build up in the future. So it's a split calculation, it's a two-part calculation. And it's a balancing act. On the one hand, we've got to estimate the investment returns. You need to estimate the contributions, and these all feed their way into the actuarial valuation process. And if you assume higher investment returns going forward, then that pulls down the immediate contribution requirements for the employers. If you assume lower investment returns are going to apply in the future, then that's going to increase your immediate contribution rates for the employers. But it's all a balancing act. The actuarial valuation process is only an estimate, and what we do as part of the actuarial valuation can really only affect the estimate of the pension costs going forward. The actual pension costs will be driven by your experience as employers, how much you pay people, and the investment returns actually earned on the fund. Now we can estimate all those going forward, we can estimate all those in advance, but I'll hold my hands up now and say we don't always get those estimates right, and in practice it's impossible to get those estimates right all the time going forward. So, as it says on the bottom there, the objective is to have enough benefits, is to have enough assets in there to be able to meet the benefits as and when they fall due. Now, in terms of formalising the actuarial valuation itself, there's a number of key documents. The key one from our perspective is the actuarial valuation report itself, where we sign off all the numbers, and then as part of that actuarial valuation report, we've got that thing in the middle there, the rates and adjustment certificates, which I know from the employer's perspective, it's probably the only thing that you're interested in out of this actuarial valuation process. But actually the key one, the real one that drives everything, is the one over to the left, the funding strategy statement, which is, if you like, the governance document between Shropshire Council and us, which is the agreement of the parameters, the agreement of the funding strategy, the agreement of everything that actually feeds into the valuation process itself. What the funding objective is, how quickly deficits get recovered from employers if that's appropriate, and that from our point of view is really the main driver, the main document. Now, when it comes round to your input as employers, that is the one real document which you get consulted on, which you have the ability to feedback your comments on. It's a consultation process where you can feed in your comments. At the end of the day, the final version of that document is one which is agreed between us as actuaries and Shropshire Council as the administrative authority. But it is one area where the council and we do take into account the comments which come back to us from the employers in formulating the funding strategy and in determining the contribution rates that come out of the valuation process. So when it comes around, which it will do next year, it's important. Okay. Now, I said that our actuarial valuation process is an estimate. We have to, in doing our calculations, we have to make a number of assumptions, estimates about the future. So I'm going to move on to a few of the main items that feed their way into that process and how we do the work that we do. Well, the first thing that we need to do when we're looking at the actuarial valuation process is look at the benefits provided by the scheme. The benefits are determined in relation to a member's salary, what they're paid, what the level of inflation is. But we just find that government constantly meddling with benefits of this scheme, our job keeps getting more and more complicated. So we've got somewhat of what's up there is a fairly simplified outline of the benefits, where before 2014, all the benefits were based on the member's final salary, their earnings near to retirement. From 2014 onwards, the benefits are based on a member's career average earnings. In other words, the pay that they've earned over their career, adjusted for inflation up to the date that they actually retire. And it's not just the formula. The benefits can be payable from a different normal retirement age. Is state pension age for benefits which you earn after 2014. In general, it's 65 for benefits which you earn before 2014. But then there was a different set of benefits which applied before 2008, where there was a separate lump sum formula, and it was different again before 2006 because there were some changes in the pension ages which happened before 2006. So it just gets messier and complication until complication. So it's great. It gives our technical staff something to do, you know, something to while away the midnight hours. So it's something that we just you just have to bear in mind. The benefits, they're not something that they're not something the administrative authority or you as employers can do anything about. They are defined under legislation, and if the government would stop meddling in them, then that would be wonderful from my point of view, but that's not going to happen. In terms of the calculations and the process that we have to go through, it's really, once we know what those benefits are, we know what the fund membership is. The next stage in the process is to project all the benefit payments going forward for each year in the future. So we've put up here, it's not the Shropshire fund that we've put up here, it's just a typical representation of a typical LGPS fund, where we've shown the projected cash flows from each body of the membership. You've got the darkest bars at the top there, which show the benefit payments which are due to your current pensioner proportion. Slightly lighter bars, which show the expected benefit outgo from your deferred members, and then the thicker green bars, the lighter green bars at the bottom, show the expected benefit outgo from your active members. And when we're going through the process, we actually have to go through that process. We have to project the benefits for each future year for every individual member within the fund. A complicated process, but we have the computer software to enable us to do that. But as I said before, these calculations are only estimates. They depend on a number of assumptions. For instance, if we assume a longer life expectancy, what we're going to do is we're going to extend those cash flows out to the right. If we assume inflation is going to be higher than our main assumption, then it's going to increase the scale of those cash flows looking downwards. It doesn't extend them out to the right, it doesn't extend the payment terms, it just increases the amounts of the cash flows in each year going forward. So there's a number of assumptions that feed the way into the process that we need to take account of and make a reasonable estimate of going forward. Okay, I talked before about splitting the benefits between past and future service and how the process works there. The aim of having enough by way of assets so that you've got the value of the benefits covered when a member retires. This is more about that little process, but in slightly more detail. In the first part of the valuation process is we look at the liabilities, the value of the liabilities that have been built up to date. We look at the body of assets that we have. The vast majority of funds in the country, not just LGPS funds, will have a deficit of existing assets against liabilities built up. So because those deficits tend to be pretty large numbers in relation to current cash flows, current contribution rates, that the effect of that gets spread over a number of years, and the contribution impact gets spread over what we call the recovery period. So for an LGPS fund, maybe typically 15, 20 years, something like that. On the future service side, what we do is we calculate the value of 1 year's worth of benefits for everybody in the fund. How much does it cost to run the fund if nobody had any benefits built up? So that's the cost of 1 year's service, which becomes the future service contribution rate. And you knock off from that the rate that the employees have to pay to get the employer's future service rate. So in general terms, when you're looking at those future service rates, you're looking at the benefits of the LGPS fund, even if you have no starting assets and liabilities, costing something of the order of 20% of payroll, knocking the 6% or so off that the employees pay leaves a net cost to the employer of around about 14% of pay, say. But that's even before you start looking at any contributions towards deficit recovery. Now, the key assumption which drives everything is the real return that we assume on the scheme's assets. And by the real return, I mean the investment return that we allow for in advance over and above the rate of CPI inflation going forward. And CPI inflation is important in the LGPS because basically all the benefits are now linked to CPI. They all increase in line with CPI. Our assumptions, as I said, they're only an estimate. They drive the estimated cost. They don't drive the actual costs. The actual cost you can only work out once all the benefits have been paid. But it's our job to try and make a reasonable estimate going forward. So what we try and do is estimate the level of the future CPI going forward, establish our best estimate of investment returns over and above CPI based on the investment strategy of the fund. It would be difficult to use that as the rate going forward, just that best estimate, because it involves a degree of risk. It leaves you nowhere to go if you don't achieve that level of return. So in setting the actuarial valuation assumptions, we allow for some prudence, allowing for the risks, the investment risks and other risks being run by the fund. And then we just check that against the investment strategy to see that the eventual return that we're allowing for is reasonable in all the circumstances. Okay. So again, the process is look at CPI, look at the real returns, and just stress test that. Are we making a reasonable assumption, allowing for the fact that we may well not get the best estimate that we make in advance. But that investment return is one of the key things. But it is a balancing act, and when you come around to do the actuarial valuations, you get some real tensions, some real pressures between the two opposing camps, between the camp that doesn't worry too much about the future, that thinks, oh no, don't worry about the deficit, it'll take care of itself, don't worry, just pay the minimum we need to, investment returns will come good. And then at the other end, you've got the sort of more conservative, the worries, oh yeah, this is all going wrong, what happens if things don't correct themselves? There is a balance to be drawn there, and you need to bring along both camps, and we do see this regularly in terms of the actuarial valuation process. And in particular, you would actually find that some, certainly not all, but some on the employer's side have got just very much a focus on, well, what's the current rate of contribution we've got to pay without being too concerned about whether that might increase in the future. but the administering authority has got to look after all the employers, and what it doesn't want to see is the possibility of employers leaving the fund, being unable to pay the contributions which are due, and leaving the liabilities behind within the fund to be picked up by the other employers. It is a real balance. And this is again just making the point that the actuarial process itself is really just an estimate. We don't know what's going to happen in advance. We don't know what's going to happen to the investment markets in 5, 10, 20 years' time. All we can do is try and make reasonable estimates in advance. It's a little bit like trying to estimate what the value of your house is going to be in 20 years' time. And you think, well, who are the people qualified to make those sorts of estimates? It's actually really, really difficult. We do what we can with the economics and what we feel is reasonable, bearing in mind the investment strategy adopted by the fund. But economic events can rapidly throw these things off course. So, the actual cost of running the scheme is never known until after all the benefits have been paid. We make assumptions which we believe are a reasonable estimate of the cost. We don't always get it right, and you have to recognise that changing the assumptions changes the estimate of that cost. It doesn't change the actual cost going forward. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the assumptions in much detail. I'm just going to pick one or two of them, sort of how we look at the assumptions, how we determine them, how we work them out as part of the actuarial valuation process. And the assumptions themselves, they really fall into two key groups. We've got the financial assumptions. What's the inflation rate we're assuming? What's the future investment return? The salary growth, rate of pension increases? How much members how much pension members will go for retirement for cash? That sort of thing. So there's a few on the financial side, and these. Particularly the investment return and the inflation rate, all these financial assumptions are really big drivers of the valuation position itself. And when we come to look at the investment return, there's really a huge spectrum of assumptions which could be made, a huge range of reasonable expectations on the investment side. If we look at the investment strategy of the structure and try and calculate what the best estimate of returns is going forward, looking long term, you'd be expecting the fund to generate something like 3 or 4% a year over and above CPI price inflation. So that's the rate which you'd expect, gives you a 50-50 chance of beating, a reasonably high hurdle rate, but still one that you stand a 50% chance of missing. And if you miss it, you end up having to pick up the tab later on. At the other end of the spectrum, pick a lower hurdle rate, one that you've got a better chance of beating, so one that is reasonably easy to hit, and one that you've got a 2 in 3 chance of hitting might be something like CPI plus 1 to 1.5%. That's actually a huge margin. There's a huge amount of difference between those two rates, and when you get into the detail of the actuarial calculations, the difference between those assumptions is very, very substantial on the contribution rates that you'd ask for employers. But it's a very wide spectrum, and you have to make some reasonable assumptions as to where you're going to go. At the 2013 actuarial evaluation, we were somewhere in the middle of that range. We assumed an investment return, a discount rate, if you like, of CPI plus 2.35%, and you're sort of in the mid-range of that. I'll come back to the other one that's up there, the national benchmark discount rate. There's a comparison set which has been done for the LGPS based on a discount rate of 3% above CPI. So, we are a little more prudent than that, but still within the margins. And this, the discount rate assumption is one of the key things which is going to be discussed, addressed, and covered for the 2016 valuation. Okay, the other set of assumptions, demographic assumptions, more related to your individual membership itself. The rates at which people retire, are they going to retire early, are they going to stay on to long retirements, the rates at which they leave due to ill health retirements, the rates they leave the fund and take deferred benefits, marital status when they leave. And the biggest one out of all this group is the life expectancy of the fund members. So we'll have a look at that one in a little bit more detail. The way that we go about doing this is that what we did in 2013 was that we examined the characteristics of the fund membership of the Shropshire Fund in order to estimate current life expectancy. I'll come back to that one on the next slide. And having done that, we then estimate from past trends how much we think life expectancy might improve in the future. So if we look, you can see on the graph that you've got there, what we've got by way of national statistics in terms of life expectancy. So the blue line is showing further life expectancy from age 65 in each year since 1904. So you're starting off with a man aged 65 in 1904 being expected to live for another 11 years or so, until 76. And that shows a sort of relatively steady, slow rate of improvement until you get to about mid-1970s, early 1980s, where the life expectancy from age 65 is still only about 12 years. So a fairly low level of improvement until that point. But from then on, there's been some fairly stark, rapid improvements in life expectancy, driven by improvements in medical science, improvements in living standards. So that if we start looking at today and the life expectancy from age 65, we're looking at something of the order of 19 years. So 65-year-olds on average has been, across the population in general, expected to live till maybe 84, which is great news if you're receiving a pension, but maybe not quite such good news if you're an employer having to fund the additional costs of that. And in terms of where that's going to go in the future, all we can do is make reasonable estimates as to how that life expectancy is going to keep on improving. And the estimate that we made at the 2013 valuation, showing a continuation of those trends, is shown there. So it's that bit of future improvements beyond 2014 is sort of very much an estimate based on past trends. When we come around to look at the characteristics of the fund, so I've put there sort of a comparison. These are national statistics showing showing life expectancies by local region, and I can see a few people themselves that are reeking out there, sort of looking at those numbers, right to the wheels on the way out. They were thinking of moving to Shropshire to get a year on their life expectancy. There is. You do get a huge variation by area, and it's actually sort of quite a popular thing. This about looking at sort of whether life expectancy does depend on the area of which you live, of where you live, and it does to an extent. what we've got up there is life expectancies of the fund area from age 65 onwards, and the rank in England and Wales by local authorities. So there's about 350 local authorities in England and Wales. So all you Shropshire residents, sort of you're nicely set up sort of in the top half of the life expectancy, but the poor souls in Telford and Leakin sort of doesn't look too great on that front. What you do find when you come to analyse the characteristics of the fund is that there's actually much more commonality. The life expectancies are much closer together for the fund membership than might be indicated by those in that scale there, or in that chart there. Because basically the fund membership is part of the working population, which tends to exhibit a better life expectancy than the population as a whole. So when we come round to making the assumptions that we made for the 2013 actuarial valuation, where we assume further life expectancies of about 24 years for men and 26 years for women at the 2013 valuation, that's a reflection of two things from the statistics which are up there. The first is that you're talking about a working population rather than the general population, and the second thing is that these national statistics don't build in anything for future improvements. They're just current expectations of life expectancies going forward.
Diverging, or are they getting? They've always been different, and females have always been higher. Is there any change in? Are they closing that gap? Is that gap getting any wider? Or?
It's closing slightly, but not quick enough in my view. Yeah, no. The general trend of male improvements is slightly higher, but there's also an element of catching up with other countries as well, where I think sort of you would find the male and female life expectancies close together as well. Okay, I can do something here. That's just looking forward a little bit to the 2016 actuarial valuation and sort of how things are looking. So just really need to recap on where we were at 2013 before we can move on to how things are looking for 2016. So 2013 basic funding position at 31st of March. We had a funding level of 76%, so the assets that we got were able to cover 76% of the liabilities which it built on. So we got liabilities of about 1.6 billion, assets about 1.2 billion, with a deficit of 0.4 billion at that time, which is going to be made up by additional employer contributions. Now, when we set the contribution rates, one of the things that we did do was we allowed for the progression to August 2013, where the investment markets had improved a bit, the deficit had reduced a little bit. So when we set the contribution requirements at the 2013 actuarial valuation, they were actually done by reference to a deficit of about 274 million from the 380 million which applied at the valuation date. So a little bit of relaxation for employers at that point. We move swiftly on. If we look at where things have moved now, if we do things on a consistent basis, and I'm not meaning to suggest that this is necessarily the basis that we'll use for 2016. That debate is going on at the moment. The markets haven't. The markets haven't really been favourable for pensions in the interim. And in particular, the way that the yields in the market have moved has meant the discount rate, the expected future investment returns have come down if we do everything on a consistent basis. So at the moment, we'd be looking at liabilities of about 2 billion and at an asset value of a little under 1.6 billion. So the deficit a little over 400 million at the current time. I mean, there's some time to go before 31st of March 2016. We'll have to see how the investment markets work out, and there's more discussion to be had with the administrative authority about how we're going to do this next valuation. There are potentially some challenges to contribution rates going forward, but we are mindful of them. In terms of how the structure fund then stacks up against all the other LGPS funds, one thing that one piece of work that we did do as part of the 2013 actuarial evaluation was we had a look at all the disclosed funding levels of all the 89 LGPS funds in England and Wales, ranked them by order, and you've got the structure funds somewhere in the middle, just below the average funding level on the disclosed funding levels. One thing I mentioned before, actuarial assumptions, a lot of scope for variation in those. And that's illustrated by the graph on the right-hand side, because if you bring everything onto a consistent set of actuarial assumptions, the picture changes, and in some cases changes hugely. The sort of grey, the lighter grey blobs on the right-hand side show the original position, and the black dots show what happens if you move everything onto a set of standardized assumptions. And this is a set of benchmarking assumptions which is being used by the LGPS board. So what you're actually seeing there is a big variation between what's reported and what is there on the standard basis. What's actually happening on the structure fund is funding levels moving up a little bit, moving up from 76% to a little above 80%, reflecting the fact that the standard benchmarking assumptions are a little bit more optimistic than the approach that we use for the structure fund. And you also see the structure fund moving a little bit closer to the average, actually, pretty much bang on the average. So it's just suggesting there that maybe there's a few margins of prudence that we might have to play with in comparison with the fund against the average, and there might be some flexibilities that we can make use of going forward. Okay, I'm going to skip the next 2 or 3 slides because I don't want to overrun my time slots. Those ones aren't critical. But I think what I want to say about the 2016 actuarial evaluation, just to wrap up on the valuation side of things, is really the discount rate, the assumed investment return, is something that we're working with the fund officers. We're going to consider the approach to setting that in the run-up to the valuation date and beyond that. Really it's sort of getting an approach which is prudent and transparent, something which everyone understands and informs a good basis for long-term planning. That we recognise as being an essential part of it. And really that risk management is one of the key areas too, and that getting that right at the fund level and employer level is an integral part of the funding strategy itself. So in terms of timelines, we've got the initial discussions and preparation for the valuation going on at the moment, and they will continue for the rest of this year and into the first quarter of next year. I mean, we expect to have some very initial outline calculations just to show the general direction of travels early in the second quarter next year, just to give the fund an idea of where things are heading at an overall headline level, and just give them a base for working forward on the main results. Then, so the rest of quarter 2 and quarter 3 is a sort of fairly heavy workload session for us, actually processing the data that comes through from Debbie and her team, which hopefully you guys as the employers will have will have submitted to her in good time and all be nice and clean, so that we can work our magic on the numbers, ready to come back with, for discussions with the employers about the results at your individual level and the implication for contribution rates. Probably around about this sort of time next year. That's the intention, that's the hope, with the aim of sort of finalising it by the following 31st of March, which is the sign-off deadline for the valuation. Okay, that's a slot on the valuation covered. I'll probably take a break there just for questions.
Can I just make sure that anybody in the room that is payroll based around this and information, that's sort of where John's saying he's going to be reviewing, so the preliminary calculations. We do put a request out that we have your returns by the end of April, so we will be wanting you to stick with it next year. A lot of people couldn't stick with that this year, and we tried to work with you, and we were still able to get our annual benefit statements out. But for next year, for valuation, making sure your data's clean, and then still doing the annual benefit statement, we will be working with you to try and ensure everybody can stick with the deadlines next year. So I just wanted to reinforce the point that you did make, that next year we're going to be tighter deadline than we were this year. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. Thank you. Pretty soon. Okay, right. I'll move on to a few sort of general LGPS issues, not directly concerned with the actuarial evaluation, but some of them sort of have some impact on it. Okay. James talked about the LGPS structural reform in his piece earlier on, and he sort of gave us a good overview of what the structural fund's up to at the moment. I'm just going to take a little bit of a step back and sort of just a little bit more of an overall LGPS line of the structural reform agenda, and where we've got to and why we've got to where we are. The LGPS structural reform, I mean, it's a huge issue for the LGPS at the moment. It's the biggest issue which is out there, which is which is occupying the minds of officers at the LGPS, and there's a huge amount of work going into it just at the moment, and it really the initial drive towards sort of more collaboration, more structural reform really started about 3 years ago. It first kicked off when Brandon Lewis came to the DCLG, and one of his first reactions really was that there were too many LGPS funds. He felt it was inefficient. Why couldn't there be more collaboration working together, possibly even more mergers of funds? Now, when you start talking about the options, then there's about more collaboration, possible mergers. There's actually a huge range of things that you can do, between experience sharing, just fund officers talking informally to one another, up through joint procurements, actually sort of going out and doing choosing investment managers together, putting assets into pools. But as soon as you start then talking about putting assets into pools, you then run into the slightly more difficult areas of delegation and governance, because you then get into a situation of, well, actually, if we're in a pool with 2 or 3 other funds, who is it that's picking the investment manager? Who's going to manage our money? How is that decision reached? And if you're going to have a joint decision as to one person to manage your money or slugs of money from different funds, you need to make sure that your governance and decision-making processes are properly set up and that you've got delegated powers to be able to do it. Combining internal teams, next stage up, and then connecting the investment vehicles, which is a more formalised structure of sort of bringing funds together, under a sort of more formal regulated structure, is the final, is the penultimate one before you would go the whole hog and potentially look at scheme mergers. So there's quite a range of options which could be considered in this sort of agenda. So as I said, the initial rumblings on this one started in about 2012 when Brandon Lewis came to the DCLG, and it was quite clearly one of his initial hobby horses. Nothing much happened for a little while because the LGPS community was at the time very, very focused on trying to sort out what the new scheme was going to look like from 2014, what the benefits were going to be. But the government pressed on in 2013 and sent out its call for evidence. And one of the things, it was quite clearly on the agenda of the DCLG ministers that they were sort of hoping that people were going to come back en masse and say, yeah, we think big scale fund mergers is a great idea. The minister, I think, was hoping that we were going to come back and say, yeah, we can merge into 4 or 5 funds and that will be all hunky dory. Actually, the fund, it didn't. It didn't come out that way. But in the meantime, the government, in my view, tried to force the agenda a little bit, and the Treasury got involved at this point, in that they put out a request for a report it was their own commissioned piece of work for them to come back on how the LGPS might get some cost savings in terms of what it was costing to run the LGPS. So this report was commissioned in the meantime. So while all this call for evidence was still running, and the report came out in December 2013, suggesting that a move to more passive investment, where you just invest in the market as a whole rather than sort of picking individual stocks. Larger, can we sort of pool things into larger assets, larger blocks of assets, with less of individual LGPS funds doing their own thing. And if you can get all that together, it quoted savings of 600 million plus as the potential annual savings across the piece. Now, I think the 600 million. So I think there's been quite a lot of cold water poured on that exact figure since then. I mean, it's round about 0.3% a year of the LGPS fund assets, but it's but I think there's still a big number out there that could be saved, albeit a sort of only small proportion of the money which is feeding its way into the LGPS in any case. So that report came out, and then after that report, the call for evidence response came out in May 2014, where the government sort of gave in on the full mergers, but it was very much pressing towards a scenario where it wanted to see larger fund sizes and greater use of passive investments, both as a way of sort of keeping the cost of the fund down and making it run more efficiently. Then, and things were going on in the background with individual funds trying to collaborate and work together. But the government piled in with its own announcement in the budget in 2014, and I'll just let you read that top one up there. So what the government was saying was, yeah, look, we in the budget statement, actually, yeah, we want we want funds to come forward. We want them to get some efficiencies, cost savings out of it, and if they don't come forward with something which is ambitious enough, then the government will legislate and will actually make them pool their investments going forward. So same sort of messages before, but actually strengthened up a bit, and it's actually made it pretty clear the way that things are going to go there. And then good old George Osborne piles in at the Tory conference on 5th of October. And he's then starting to go further in the budget statement. I think there's a bit of a headline grab in this statement. But he's saying, okay, we've got 89 funds at the moment. We're going to create half a dozen British wealth funds across the country, and they'll invest billions in the infrastructure of their regions. So you're talking about regional wealth funds, half a dozen, and if he had wanted to get up the noses of everybody in the LGPS community, I think he found a surefire way of doing it with this press release before his speech. In practice, when he actually came round to make his speech, a lot of this didn't quite feature in it, but it had already gone out in press releases, so the damage was done. But I think he got tipped off how badly it would go down and how some of this was workable. But what Treasury did after putting out this initial statement is they came back and said, actually, it says wealth funds, but we don't really mean sovereign wealth funds. We do actually mean just funds collaborating with one another. We don't really mean regional. We're quite happy to let funds decide how they want to collaborate together. It doesn't have to be in regions. Oh yeah, and infrastructure. Yeah, well, we can't actually make these funds invest in infrastructure. I think they'd like to, but they recognise that they can't. And I think there's a suspicion amongst some in the LGPS community. I've got to be careful what I say here if I'm being filmed. There's a suspicion amongst some in the LGPS community that the government sees the LGPS funds as just being a bit of a cheap way of getting some infrastructure investments. And the LGPS funds are not that daft. They're not going to give the assets for free for them to pick up the tab on the investment returns. They quite happily invest in the infrastructure funds if the projects were there, if the returns are there to do it, and that debate's going to run and run. Is that a fair comment, James? Anything you feel free to argue with me on any of that?
No, I think we're back to it.
Okay, so where we are at the moment, tons of work going on behind the scenes. James has said what the Shropshire Fund is doing in terms of working with some other authorities and collaborating on investments. There's lots of other initiatives going on around the country with people doing similar things to the Shropshire Fund and their group. With funds developing their own pooling proposals. Some collective vehicles already out there, already announced. The London Collective Investment Vehicle, where all the London councils have announced their intention to come together, and the Lancashire Fund has set up with the London Pension and Fund Authority Pension Fund to announce their own regulated vehicle. In essence, what they're doing is they're setting up their own investment management company to manage most of their assets going forward. And I think they're hoping that they'll get other funds to join in with that particular collaboration. So, and we've got other funds sort of looking at pooling together, but not quite as formal as the London and the London Lancashire partnership going forward. So, I think sort of over the next few weeks and months we'll actually see more and more funds coming out and announcing what they're doing, and there's I'm expecting some more announcements before too long on that front. Okay. I'll take the structural reform. Anyone got any questions on that before I move on to a little session on discretions and policies? Or this one's sort of more at home at the sort of individual employer level. The discretion policies. What I want to, I know there's going to be a session later on, but I just wanted to draw out one little example, one recent case which has gone through the pensions ombudsman, which sort of just got a few little lessons in it which are worth bearing in mind. Okay, so this is a case that's I think it was it last month? This one came out of the ombudsman, Elliott versus the NHS. This was the case. The case dates back quite a while, dates back to 2011, 2012. But it just takes these things take a long while to go through the system by the time all the decisions are reached. Miss Elliott was an employee of a company called Care Trust Plus, which participated in the LGPS, and then in June 2011, people tupied out into a new employer. They left the LGPS and they were given the opportunity to join the NHS pension scheme. Now, Miss Elliott got 35 years service. She was age 54, so she'd already got to the stage where she met what we call the rule of 85, where you can take your early retirement benefits without reduction if you've got the employer consent. But obviously, she wasn't old enough to be able to take her benefits, which wasn't quite old enough to be able to take her benefits without incurring the big tax charge. You've got to be 55 to do that. So she didn't quite meet that criteria. But she decided that she was going to leave her benefits leave her accrued benefits in the LGPS because of the existence of the Rule 85 rule. So she became a deferred pensioner, and then she hit age 55 in August 2011, and in September 2011 she applied to her funds for early payment of her deferred benefits. Now, she wanted benefits unreduced. She didn't want to have an actuarial reduction. If she'd been made redundant while she was still working, while she was still a member of the LGPS, she'd have been entitled to that. So the fund, which was the East Riding Fund, sort of said, look, this isn't one for us. Whether you can take your benefits unreduced, it's not one for us to decide. It's one for your employer, because there's a cost involved and the employer has to pick up the tab. So the fund referred it to the employer, who at the time was Care Trust Plus. And the employer said no, but actually the employer's reply on this was a little bit daft. And I'll come back to that one in a minute too. And what the employer actually said was, actually you don't have an automatic right to have unreduced benefits, which was true. And the employer said, actually, we didn't have. We didn't have a discretions policy in place in 2011, so we can't possibly agree to you taking early retirement at that point without reduction. we don't have the power to agree to it. So your question doesn't arise. So that was the basis of the employer's refusal on this point. And then the employer, in a way, sort of, it tried to rectify the situation post-event by drawing up a discretions policy, by putting in place a discretions policy. But it only did that in 2012, and in the later arguments, it referred back to the 2012 policy, saying, but you weren't eligible under the 2012 policy. And oh, by the way, there's a big cost to letting you go early as well, which we don't want to pay. So these were the arguments that the employer advanced. And Ms. Elliott sort of said, well, the cost isn't relevant because when I tubed across in June 2011, you let a load of other people go on enhanced early retirement terms. You just didn't do it for me because I wasn't quite old enough to take the benefits. And you allowed other cases to proceed. So I'm being treated unfairly here. It's not fair that you've allowed it for other employees and not allowed it for me. And Pensions Ombudsman basically agreed with Miss Elliott's arguments. It said, okay, yeah, what the employer's done here is wrong. It's not reached a decision, or at the very least, it's been very poor in the way it's communicated the decision to the employee concerned. And actually, just because of the fact that you didn't have a discretions policy in place in 2011, it doesn't mean that that's a basis for not being able to reach a decision. You can still reach a decision on the merits of the case. And the fact that you then put in place a policy in 2012 which would have ruled out this case had it been in place at the time is also not relevant, because it wasn't in place at the time. That's just a matter of fact. So they referred it, what the Pensions Ombudsman did was they said to the employer, look, you've not considered this properly, you've got to go back and reconsider it and make a decision in this case. And in essence, they're saying consider the case on its merits. And they awarded the member a princely sum of £200 in compensation to be paid by the employer. So all a bit of a mess. Started in 2011, resolved in 2015. From the employer's perspective, the employer's gone through quite a lot here. Okay, it's now in a position where it needs to review that decision, and it's got a possible cost of paying the benefits early if it decides to agree to that request. Actually, I think the employer's probably got away with it in this case, because I think my reading of it was the Pensions Ombudsman wasn't saying you've got to review this case and award the benefit. They're just saying you've got to review this case properly, and you haven't done that so far. So the employer will probably get away with the cost in this case, but the employer's messed up here, and it's been it's fairly publicly messed up because because this case has gone to the Pensions Ombudsman and got fairly widely reported on, and it's got £200 fine as well, which is I guess a little slap over the wrist for it. But you've also got the internal time, the external. There's probably a lawyer or two involved along the way here, and I know as an actuary that lawyers don't come cheap either. You've got all that. You've got the internal time and the internal deliberations that you'll have to have gone through. And why not just get your discretions policies there written out right in the first place? It would probably take the employer an hour to put it together if you use the template provided by the fund. It's probably spent 3, 4, 5 weeks of time on this one, all told. It's just inefficient. Okay, so that's a nice little setup for this afternoon's session on discretionary policies. Okay. For those of you who have got a 31st of March company or employer accounting year, this next slide is going to be relevant to you. The rest of you, well, I'm quite happy for you to remain asleep for the next slide if you want. Just in terms of one thing that's going on in local authorities in general, we calculate, carry out, and deliver IAS 19, FRS 17, FRS 102. It's all the same if you're familiar with any of these terms. Figures to go in an employer's accounts. Now, there's a largest group of employers that we have to do as at 31st of March. And in the past, we've been able to deliver those mid-April, probably third week in April. There's a bit of estimation that goes into that because we can't get all the investment return information that we need. But it's still a reasonable an approach which is good enough for the accounting purposes. Unfortunately, when we come around to 2017, that sort of delivery timescale looks as though it's going to be too late for councils because their accounting deadlines are being brought forward by central government. So we have to start looking at some sort of ways where we can deliver the accounting numbers a little bit earlier. One possibility is to try and get all the delivery into early April. After we're able to get a reasonable estimate of the way things stand. The big issue that we're getting in terms of doing the IAS 19 calculations is that they, in theory, depend on market conditions at the year end, so 31st of March in this case. So if you're going to take 31st of March market conditions into account, you can't actually start pressing all the final buttons until after 31st of March and into early April. But you then get into a situation where all local authorities want the figures at within this particular window, and it creates a huge resourcing constraint, not just for us but for the local authorities as well. So one thing we might end up having to do, and we're still in discussions about this with the auditors, with audit firms, is maybe start to look at bringing the delivery of the IAS 19 numbers back into March. What we're going to have to do if we do that is do an earlier cut of the data, a little bit of an earlier estimate of some of the payroll and benefit payments and contributions data, and we'd have to do it at a stage where market conditions at 31st of March are not, have still not been determined. So it's just sort of introducing another little estimate into the process. So we're talking to auditors about that. I mean, for the non-councils, by councils I'm including people like the fire authority in that. They're still going to have these early deadlines. But for the non-councils, if your auditors aren't happy with the earlier delivery to that extent, it might mean that we could come back and do the numbers at a later stage. It's just sort of late April, early May, that sort of time scale. It's just that if we do that, we end up having to split the delivery and the numbers into two batches, so it's less efficient and you lose some of the economies of scale. But that's certainly something that we can consider going forward. Just so one to bear in mind if you're involved in that side of things. Okay. Exit payments. Another delightful little mess caused by Mr. Osborne here. Okay, so the government earlier this year announced that it was going to seek to cap exit payments for at a level of £95,000 for what it called public sector employers. So it put this out as a consultation for people to respond to. Consultation ran for 3 months. The consultation closed, and within nanoseconds, the government put out its response to the consultation. So you did wonder really whether the government had already made up its mind. I don't know about before the consultation started, but certainly before the consultation closed in any case, and it basically said, yes, we think this is a great idea, we're going to do it anyway. So why am I putting 95,000 exit payment limit into a presentation about the LGPS? It's nothing about pension benefits, is it? Unfortunately, it is about pension benefits as well, because one thing that this £95,000 limit includes is the cost of paying benefits early to someone who's retiring if they're being made redundant, because it's a standard term of the LGPS at the moment that if you make up someone over 55 redundant, you've got to pay their accrued benefits in full without any reduction. The employer has to pay the cost, and that cost is going to come out of the 95,000. Now the thing is, even for some sort of what you might call mid-range earners, sort of we'll look at quartile, but someone with 20 or 30 years service earns 30,000 and is an LGPS member. They're probably going to hit that £95,000 limit alone on the top-up costs on their pension alone. Even before you start talking about any sort of severance or redundancy payments. So there's going to have to be some trade-off between what the member takes as cash, what by way of severance payments, how much he takes by way of an enhanced pension. So there's a lot of things that we don't know in how this is going to work forward. So we don't know whether there's going to be a consistent calculation methodology across the LGPS nationally, because at the moment each fund, each employer is, but each fund in general can, and to a large extent does, adopt their own calculation methodology. We don't know whether the 95,000 cap is going to bite first on the exit payments or on the early retirement strain. We're not quite sure of which employers are going to be caught. The government said it's local and central governments, and by the way, there's a list on the ONS website which details everybody who's caught. But the fund here is going to have to really rely on employers knowing whether they're caught by this limit and being able to implement it. So it's really going to be your responsibility as employers to be clear in your own minds about whether you're caught by this whether this £95,000 limit applies to you or not. The funds aren't going to know which employers are caught. And from the point of view of processing these early retirements, it's going to create this sort of probably semi-peculiar hokey-cokey thing of you as an employer come to the fund, asking for a quote for the cost of the early retirement, and if the total exit payment is going to be more than 95,000, then you need to do a little bit of to-ing and froing to how much you can give him, how much you can give him or her as a severance payment, and how much goes in by way of early retirement payments. My suspicion as to what will come out is that the regulations for the LGPS are going to have to be changed to accommodate this particular provision, because at the moment the enhanced early retirement terms are as of right settled. So my suspicion is that what it'll say is if the exit payment itself, if the cash payment to the employee if the total is going to go above 95,000, then the employee can take so much of that as he was entitled to in cash, and the balance of it goes towards topping up the pension arrangements. And there might be some flexibility where the employee can sort of surrender some of the severance payments in order to top up the pension. So there might be an element of mix and match, a little bit of employer choice comes out in due course. But it's just going to make the workload of Debbie and your team ever more increasing, as is the way of government at the moment, I'm afraid. They draft regulations out for consultation in the autumn. So sometime before Christmas Eve, but I know talking to Bob Holloway at the DCLG about 3 weeks ago, it was pretty near the top of his urgent pile. He knew it was one they had to get on with. Pensions, freedoms and tax. So just setting this little thing up for Helen's session this afternoon. Just going to do an overview. Sorry, I got a couple of the slides in the wrong order. We just have to chop and change it a little bit. I mean, we're going to start off with 2014 and what happened in the budget last year, sort of by way of an announcement. The Chancellor announced a good deal of extra flexibility in terms of defined contribution pensions. So this doesn't apply directly to the LGPS, but it does apply to what we call DC, defined contribution, money purchase arrangements, call them what you like, where the employer and employee pays in a certain amount of cash and the pot builds up, and you take whatever benefits that pot will buy at retirement. So historically, you got to retirement, you take a bit of that fund as a cash lump sum, and you generally have to use the rest to buy an annuity, a pension payable for the rest of your life. And last year, the Chancellor announced, no, we're going to abolish that. Members can buy annuities if they want to, but they don't have to. We'll allow them to take all the money out as a single lump sum if they want to. First 25% of it is tax-free, the same lump sum as you can take tax-free at the moment. But then anything over and above that is just taxable at your normal marginal rate. And there were some other things that went alongside that as well, some relaxation in the trigger commutation and the small pot commutation, which applies to defined benefit, to defined contribution schemes, and to defined benefit schemes like the LGPS. So that's quite a lot of extra flexibility. Now, I said it doesn't apply directly to the LGPS, but if a member of the LGPS did want it to apply to them, then there is a way around it, which is that they can take a transfer of all of their LGPS benefits to a defined contribution scheme, and then take the proceeds of that as cash. So it's a workaround. It's not ideal, but it will work for some members. Does that work? Well, in theory, sort of, yes, it does. What's the effect on the LGPS? Well, okay, there's some. You might get a little bit more by way of trivial commutation and small sums commutation, and sort of you'll be able to settle some of your benefits. But if members do actually take a transfer out to the LGPS, you've got you've got some increased transfer activity, you've got increased payout by way of transfers, and it can, if a lot of members take up the option, actually create a change in the duration of your liabilities and actually how you go about managing your risks under the fund. So some things to be aware of if this is something which a lot of members take up. But you also have to remember that a lot of defined benefit schemes, such as the LGPS, have got defined contribution sections as well. So the structured fund has got its AVCs with Prudential, and these DC forms can be applied to that section of the scheme. So the actual effects and how it affects the individual funds really do depend on what happens and what choices members decide they want to take up. So is this flexibility? Is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? I mean, I think in general terms, if you're being paternalistic and looking at it from the employee's point of view, you've got to say there's some dangers, there's some risks in there. And actually, with the transfer terms that are generally on offer from the LGPS, it would normally be very difficult for a member to take a transfer out of the LGPS and then be able to replicate his benefits by having moved his money away. From the funds and the employer's point of view, there's some advantages. You manage to settle some of your liabilities, so you remove some of the risks that you're running. But nevertheless, you still get some issues around the treasury management side. You might find that if there's a lot of this activity going on, you're having to pay out monies at times when investment levels are low, and it might increase some funds' negative cash flow positions where they're paying out more in benefits than they're receiving in contributions. And you've got potential costs of disinvestment. On the whole, if it were taken up in a big way, then it would probably help the funds manage the liabilities, help the funds manage the deficit positions. But I think it's early days yet, and I think we're seeing a big increase in interest, but not such a big increase in actual take-up. I'll let Debbie correct me if I'm wrong on that one in relation to the structured fund.
No, we wonder whether, because we've communicated, we feel we've communicated quite well to our members. We have some people asking, but not many are coming and actually asking now to have formal quotations. And also, they do need to pay for advice nowadays. So we've had to change a lot of our processes to ensure that this is all covered. But other funds, some of them are getting lots and lots of requests. We're not at the moment.
And then, so slightly more recently in this year's budget, the Chancellor announced a couple of changes, sort of, to more restrictions on pensions tax. In terms of how things are going to work. So at the moment, you've got a lifetime allowance of 1.25 million. So in other words, the value of your total benefits across all funds can't be more than 1.25 million. And in general, that sort of means that you're not if your overall gross pension is 60 grand or so, then your risk of additional tax charges arising. That limit is going to be reduced to 1 million, so pension about 50 grand from April 2016. So a slightly more restrictive regime on the overall level of pension benefits that you're allowed to build up. Okay, for the LGPS in particular, that particular measure is just one that is going to affect the higher long-serve type bracket. but it's just one thing that sort of just needs to be borne in mind and is there. But the slightly more major, slightly more difficult change was the change in the annual allowance, which is the value of the pension benefits which you're allowed to build up each year. At the moment, there's a maximum £40,000 allowance which applies to everybody. Looking forward, if your total earnings, including your pension contributions, your value of your pension benefits, are more than 150,000, then that £40,000 allowance starts to get tapered down. So it's something that will start to affect your high earners. Will affect people earning more than 110,000 out there. So if you get someone whose earnings are as much as 210,000, including pension contributions, that's the break point whereby you get down to the minimum annual allowance, for which you can have tax relief of 10,000 quid. So, slight change in it is going to affect relatively few people, but the people it does affect is going to affect in a big way. But you'll hear more about the details of those two particular changes in particular later on this afternoon. The slightly wider one, which the Chancellor announced, was a green paper on the future of tax relief in the UK. And at the moment, the way pensions work is that you get tax relief on the way in, the investment roll-up is tax-free, you get taxed on the way out in general. Now the Chancellor has said he wants to review that. Is that the best way of structuring pensions tax relief going forward? Should we tax them like ISAs, where you pay the money in out of taxed income up front, but you have it taxed free, the roll-up is tax-free, and you don't get taxed at the other end? Or are there any better methods of having tax relief, and of encouraging people to save going forward? If the current situation from tax relief up front changes, that is going to be an absolute huge game changer, particularly for schemes like the LGPS, where the very structure, the underlying structure, the underlying the way things work is so intrinsically linked with this tax-exempt upfront system that there would have to be some huge, far-reaching changes. Consultation on that, which the Chancellor opened, has now closed. We expect to see more details in the autumn statement. Watch this space. That one could be an absolute game changer. Finally, I'll just very briefly sort of settle something for Debbie and her team's session this afternoon. So one of the things introduced by the 2013 Public Service Pensions Act was a formal role in regulating public sector pensions for the pensions regulator. Now, the regulator it's not got quite the same powers as it does in the private sector. In the private sector, it spends a lot of its time regulating funding of pension schemes. It doesn't have that role for the LGPS and the other public service schemes. But what it has been charged with is looking at the governance and operation and operation of the boards of the LGPS. So there's a whole list of areas where the pensions regulator is getting involved, has set out guidance, and has outlined a little bit of training in his public service toolkit, which you're all free to go and have a look at. There's some good training material on there. I've highlighted on the right-hand side the particular areas that are likely to be of interest to employers, where the regulator is specifically charged with looking at breaches, late payment of employer contributions, failure to pass across employee contributions, and record keeping. Record keeping is going to start to become a big issue. I'm sure it's going to come more to the fore in the LGPS. The regulators taking a much more hands-on approach in the private sector in the last year or two, and has actually been very structured about how it's told private sector schemes about how it's got to have its data set up, its data verified and vetted and audited, and which particular bits of data it expects to have right, and which bits of data it's prepared to accept a little bit of leeway on. And I expect more of that to come forward in the LGPS. So I think in terms of the discussions between you and the fund, there is going to be ever more of that going forward. And please, as Debbie said before, do get your data in on time, especially next year for the actuarial valuation. I don't want any delays in that.